Hola Chicas! Welcome to 20 Questions With, a podcast in conjunction with Latinitas Magazine. Latinitas Magazine is a strong voice for Latina and POC youth, which is why the hosts of 20 Questions With are all young Latinas who are looking to gain experience in innovative and creative fields just like you. In each episode, you'll hear from striking individuals who are inspiring today's youth with their passion, motivation, and grit. Today, join me, Elisa Garcia, and volunteer writer Dana Garibaldi while we sit down and ask 20 questions with producers Estefania, Bonilla, Hernandez, and Craig Whitney of the Red Note podcast. The Red Note podcast is a 10-episode podcast series hosted by investigative journalist Lydia Cacho. The show follows the stories behind the femicides in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. The podcast is the first fully bilingual podcast with complete episodes in both English and Spanish under the title La Nota Roja. Both the Red Note podcast and La Nota Roja were written and directed by Craig Whitney with Estefania as the lead producer. We had an amazing time talking with both Estefania and Craig, and they were able to walk us through some valuable information about the femicides. With that said, this episode will be divided into two parts for our listeners.
You all mentioned that the femicides in Juarez they're not just happening just there, they're happening, all over. It extends to multiple countries as well. So should others be concerned for their safety during this time? And how does that issue extend to those other countries? How should people tackle that sort of awareness?
We really tried to keep the podcast focused as much as possible on Ciudad Juarez because, we didn't just want to talk about the acts of violence, but we also wanted to talk about the social fabric of the city and the lives of the victims and their families outside of their deaths. And to have the time to do that in 10 episodes, we felt like it was more important to try and convey a comprehensive picture of this one city than to try and tackle too many subjects at once and not end up really tackling any of them that effectively. But one of the things I think that becomes really apparent as you study the femicides in Juarez is that the same pattern of investigative failures and the way that local and city and state governments respond to manifestations of violence against women has been repeated in a very similar fashion in many states across Mexico and, as you mentioned, in other Latin American countries. But Juarez was the city where, I don't know if you can say that this issue began, but it certainly was first publicized, the femicide in Juarez. But it's not unique there, and I think Estefania probably could speak more eloquently than I could to the personal dangers that sort of systemic failure has brought about for Latin American women.
Femicides in Juarez spread throughout Mexico. It did a lot. It did toward these 25 years, but it didn't happen because of Juarez. It happened because of a structure that it's pretty violent against women per se. For example, one of the things that always happened that it's really interesting to see is that in the sites where more women were experiencing violence and everything were precisely places where maquiladoras were put. It's because of the poor infrastructure that the Mexican state hasn't gone through all their population, because obviously, these maquiladoras and these factories, they give you and they offer a job for people that do not have a lot of acquisitive capacity. And so it always experienced like a lot of very massive migration to these points where the maquiladoras are. And the state does not have the quick response or enough response or budgetary response to attend this kind of population that it's coming through and they are migrating to these parts of the country. So what happens is that you have a lot of families living together, like in hacinamiento. I don't know the word in English for that. So they live like a lot of people, like in this kind of populous parts. They don't have running water. They don't have electricity. They come short with education. It's kind of hard to access to some health, that going into health services to attend things like a flu or something like that. So when you have all these kind of precarious circumstances around, then is when you now experience a lot of violence, and then is when you experience like a lot of stress. And that is what happens, and that's what we have been observing that happens when a maquiladora is put in some part of the country. And that happens also, I don't know, in some other various industries, that it's not only maquiladoras, but they give like this kind of work that is not that specialized. And a lot of people like wants to go towards that kind of job opportunities that for them it's life-saving. It's a way of a meaning of life, you know, and it's not the best, but it's what there it is. That's the reason why others should be like very aware of their own safety, because this is not about some simple thing that it's bad against the good or something like that. It's because we have to start thinking that we need to build communities, and we need to start to build places where they are safe, not that they can have things that the state should guarantee, as access to water, access to electricity, access to education, access to health services. And it shouldn't be a privilege. It shouldn't be something that you will have to have like a lot of money to pay for that. I mean, I'm pretty sure that you from the US understand what I'm talking about. No, it's just that it's different context as a societies that we are, but it's kind of the same thing in the background. I'm pretty sure that you can like relate to these kind of very difficult things that happens in all cities and everything. And that's the reason why it's not something only about Mexico. It's also about a lot of countries that do not there are states that are not rich suffers of all of this. And they can't respond how it's needed for the circumstance and the situation these people is.
I think that it's a lot more compelling to talk about serial killers or narcosatanicos and the role that they had in these serial murders in Juarez. But as Estefania pointed out, living on the outskirts of the city and having to take a bus 2 hours to get to your job and having to walk down a street without street lamps arguably plays a much bigger role in these murders happening than serial killers crossing the border or any of these kind of fantastic theories that have arisen about the femicides. And the reason that people are living in these conditions is so that we can buy cheaper DVD players in the United States. And as we talked about before, what I hope people will take away from listening to this podcast is the truly systemic nature of these murders, that you have an interplay of international economic and social forces that are causing these deaths to occur. And so even though in the United States there's not much we can do about corruption in the Mexican government or machismo in Mexican society, there are things we can do to prevent guns from being brought across the border, to arm criminal groups on the other side of the border, or to make informed decisions about, I don't even think it's about us making informed decisions, because it's the same thing about how the petrochemical industry started this concept of my carbon footprint. Like, it's our individual responsibilities to address global warming when you have these multinational oil companies that are really and truly responsible for it. I mean, one of the things that was horrifying in the last year was that they opened the maquiladoras up very quickly after the pandemic started. I think like April and May, they were all running at full, or many of them were running at high capacity. because to close down these factories would disrupt supply chains of manufacturing to the United States. It's really hard for us as individuals to make more informed decisions to change the product supply chains in the United States. But I hope that by understanding the systemic nature of this violence, people can also understand that they have a place in that system and there are things that they can do to exert pressure to make it a system where women along the border don't end up paying the ultimate cost for its existence.
Yes, definitely. I definitely agree. I think that the Juarez femicides, they're very multifaceted. There's lots of different causes that contribute to those type of crimes. And so I wanted to ask on that note, how do you go about in creating this podcast, capturing the complexity of not only these murders, but of Ciudad Juarez as a whole, having some sort of balance between these murders and the Juarez culture?
Well, I think that bringing Elisa Hernandez on board the project was really important for that because she's a journalist from Juarez who's been working there for the last, 10 or 15 years, Estefania? Yeah, 15 years working as a journalist in Juarez during the cartel war in 2008 to 2012 and growing up there. So not only did she have a lot of relationships with interviewees that she was able to invite to take part in the podcast and perform the interviews with, but also in helping us bring all these different people into the project as interviewees, it was really helpful in having a really broad spectrum of perspectives that we were including in the story. Because for thousands of homicides and disappearances over a course of 27 years, you're talking about people have a lot of different theories about why this is happening. While we obviously tried to put the stories of the victims and their families at the forefront of the podcast, in terms of the experts who were offering up interpretive comments about it, we really tried to include people who approached the story criminologically, who focused on the role that the drug trade played in these murders, experts who focused on the role that gender plays in these murders, people who have examined the story academically, people who have firsthand experience that were part of these investigations in a direct fashion, and to, as much as possible, balance them out in the script writing and editing, to offer listeners a wide variety of interpretations so that they would be able to form their own conclusions about the factors that played the biggest role in these serial murders. Alicia was very important in that, and Lydia was very important in that too, because by the time Lydia started reviewing the scripts, I had been looking at them for close to 6 months at that point in time. I didn't have fresh eyes anymore. It was really, really important for the project that when Lydia became actively involved in the script writing and editing, that she was able to come in and smack me upside the head and throw cold water on some aspects of the scripts to make sure that they retained the balance that we had aimed for in the conception of the project.
I mean, you can't understand that context and you can understand where there is a trouble or something like that if you don't understand of which kind of country or place or culture you're talking about. You can't come into a culture or you can't come into a city and just talk about it so lightly and just because from your own perspective. You have to understand the context and you have to understand where are they coming from? And you need to understand that complexity. Of course, you need to understand the culture of Ciudad Juarez and how it was created as a city. No, the understanding that, for example, the city was El Paso del Norte, and El Paso and Ciudad Juarez was the same city in the 19th century, for example, if I'm not wrong. Or at least you have to understand that, for example, you can't understand Ciudad Juarez without the United States, and a lot of Texas can't understand itself without Mexico and the border. Because one of the biggest problems and complexity because of this, it's because it's a binational transaction. Everything is a transaction, the legal and the illegal. If you don't understand that, and you don't understand, for example, the close relationship there is between the US and Mexico, you can't understand part of the problems that are going on in Mexico. If you don't understand the relationship between the US and Latin America, there's a lot of issues in Latin America that you can't understand until you are aware that we can't figure us out without the US and vice versa. You can't figure yourselves out without us. When you have that kind of complexity, you have to understand the culture, you have to understand language, you have to understand the impulses, the needs, the reasons why they are living there in Ciudad Juarez, for example. Ciudad Juarez is a migrant city. It's full of migrants. Right now, there is Cubans and there are people from Honduras and from El Salvador trying to get into the U.S. through Ciudad Juarez, and they're seeking asylum and they can't because all the policies that for the past 4 years and before that happened between the two countries. So that's the only way that you can address to a problem, and that's the only way you can address respectfully and ethically to an issue whenever you are. It was really important to have historians, it was really important to have journalists, it was really important to have researchers, and not only from Mexico, from the US, we also had Molly Malloy, we also had Eve Ensler, we also had Diana Washington Valdez. I mean, we also had like a lot of people from over there, from here, from Mexico, and people that here from Mexico, like Oscar Maynez, who has operations in Mexico and operations in El Paso, and he goes in between and he can tell you about both sides of the border. No, and that's something that Alicia was really smart to think about. Craig and I thought about it, and then Alicia came into with all the booking with the interviewees, and it was an amazing slate of interviewees that we had with them, thanks to Alicia, no? All the proposals that she came in with us. You need to capture that complexity because you can't understand a murder or you can't understand a social phenomena if you don't have that other part. If you don't have the other part, what you're doing is sensationalism. If you don't take the time to understand the culture and understand the tradition and understand the issues and understand the challenges as a city, as people, the history and everything, and you are only reporting on the murders, it's because you only want to do a spectacle. You only wanted to do show business. That's not the red note. And that's something that Craig and I always had like really cleared from day one. And that even was one of the reasons why I came in as a producer for the movie and everything, because there is that compromise. We will need to do like all this kind of work and all this kind of stuff to do what we were going to do. And right now we did a podcast. We hope there is going to be a movie. We hope there's going to be also another project that maybe will entitle some other binational storytelling. That's about it.
Thank you for that response. That was very, very well put. Of course, in trying to capture this very large complexity of Ciudad Juarez and the culture and the transactions that make that up, there is obviously many people working on this podcast. So in uncovering sort of the research or in doing the interviews, was there any sort of fact or statement that really stood out to you and was sort of impactful or hard-hitting and really changed your perspective?
I mean, there are so many.
Well, I have to say, the entire podcast, it was like so impactful and it was like a punch in the face. So I wouldn't know how to answer that question in another way, to be really honest with you.
It's kind of like what we were saying about we tried to approach this subject in a really systemic fashion to highlight the complexity of these crimes, that it's not just like a serial killer on the loose, but that it's this really complex interplay of forces. And so like there was never going to be like one answer that somebody gave us that just unlocks the whole story and, oh, now we suddenly get it. It was just like it's almost too complex to put into words. I mean, there's this really good documentary I heard about a couple of years ago. is trying to explain how capitalism works. And it describes how a pencil is manufactured. And a pencil is not a very complicated thing, but like to vulcanize the rubber to be in the eraser, or to the metallurgy that goes into creating the little metal thing. And you have a lumberjack that cuts down the wood, and you have to mine the graphite. And the point they tried to make in this film is that even a pencil is so complicated that no one person can manufacture it. And I think that really was like how this felt to me, was that we really tried to put as much focus as possible on the stories of the victims and their families, but talking with experts and investigators and journalists and members of the government, there are so many layers to this. If we had wanted to do a 20-episode podcast, we could have easily done that from just the interviews that we did, because there's so much complexity to this story. So there was never like one moment or even one interviewee that just kind of unlocked things. It was much more like weaving a tapestry together. We just tried to combine as many connective threads to make that tapestry as rich of a portrait of these very tragically complex events as we possibly could.
Yes, I completely agree. And that also actually answers my other question, because in this very complex sort of situation, there's not really like some sort of case or some sort of situation that's most difficult, because all of it is really disheartening and terrible. After going through this process and documenting this investigation into the Juarez femicides, what was your biggest takeaway from it all? What was the thing that really stuck with you, or the thing that you learned at the end of everything?
The biggest takeaway, it was the knowledge of myself and my own privilege as a woman from Colombia that had access to education and had the opportunity to move to another country in a very privileged way of living and having the opportunities that I have. It's like opening your eyes of the blessings that you have, and not because you had a lot of effort, it's just because you won a biological lottery to being born in a family that had the means to have you in the way that they had you. You know, that gives you a lot of responsibility also. I mean, if you're somebody who get a little bit of consciousness around that, then you become somebody who can now appreciate and be a lot more grateful for the things that you have. And now, if you want to do something that at least I have that kind of inclination to, make something better for others and trying to make this place a little better for myself. But making this place better for myself implies that I have to look for the beneficial of others and of the society, on how we can create community. For me, that's been like the biggest takeaway, no? Like having a lot of more empathy towards the others, and being like really conscious of the things that you have and how do you put that at service of others that are less privileged than you, or how to make life in a more conscious way, because maybe you are not allowed, or you want to have like the path to clear to make things better to others, or maybe you don't have that calling. Some people have that calling, some people that have that kind of easy going and easy way, like to take care of others. In my case, personally, my way of doing it was doing this podcast. My way was doing it in a way that it was in an ethical and responsible way. My way was having this kind of reflections and having this kind of thought about where am I, where I'm standing, from where I'm standing, and how do I add something of value to my society. That will be for me the biggest takeaway that I took from all this experience.
I think that the moment that stands out to me the most from going to Juarez this time and to record the podcast was we did an interview in a bar in Juarez with this collective called Resiste. They do this like graffiti art. They make like memorials to victims of femicide, and they do all kinds of other art as well. And we were doing an interview with them in this bar. When we started, it was totally empty. It was, the afternoon. But by the time we finished the interview, it had filled up with maybe like 20 people. We finished the interview and everybody was able to make noise again. And the sound guy came over to Estefania and me and told us we had forgotten to record room tone for the interviews, which we would need to edit them together. And so we had to go around to the bar and ask all these people who were trying to enjoy their drinks if they could be quiet for like 5 minutes so we could record room tone. And I remember just sitting in that bar with all these people who were so nice to be quiet for us and just thinking how really special it was to have the opportunity not just to do the project, but also to experience that moment with the crew and with everybody in that bar. And we were walking out and this guy came up to me and he thanked me for us coming and doing the project. And it really meant a lot to me because I remember the first time I went to Ciudad Juarez, I mean, I'm walking around and this guy shouts out at me, "Welcome to Mexico, Americans." And, you know, I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm in a very fortunate position to be able to go there and do a project like this. And I really want everybody in Ciudad Juarez to like what we're doing. I really want to do a good job for everybody in that city. I mean, I've been working on this project and Estefania as well. We've been working on the project together for several years. And, you know, you spend that much time, even in an intellectual sense, with one particular place, and it really becomes important in your life. So that guy telling us we were on the right track and to keep going was just the most miraculous moment for me. And I think the other thing that really hammered home for me was just how hospitable and warm and resilient and strong the people of that city are. I mean, 10 years ago, Juarez was the most dangerous city in the entire world. And the fact that the residents of Juarez have come out of the other side of that experience with the warmth and hospitality and humor and gusto that we saw among the people we talked to and the people we just interacted with casually during the production, that's the thing that stood out to me the most. And I wish we'd been able to talk more about that in the podcast. I mean, again, we could have done 20 episodes on this if we had been so inclined to. It was just really nice to be able to make that connection with everybody in the city and to hear that a few people in Juarez liked the way we were going about things.
The Red Note does a great job of amplifying the voices of the families of the victims. How do you feel about the common trope in true crime documentaries and podcasts and things like that focus primarily on the suspect or the murderer? Things like the Ted Bundy tapes and Night Stalker, etc.
Well, I mean, I get why people do that because a crime and an investigation and a trial is an inherently dramatic process. I mean, like, somebody gets murdered, that's dramatic. And then you've got cops and they're out there looking for them and they catch the bad guy and there's a trial. I mean, you know, like Law and Order did like 22 seasons of that because it's an inherently dramatic situation. And I think there's also something about the true crime genre that speaks to our culture right now. Like in the same way that like in the 50s and 60s, there were Westerns. You had Western movies and Western TV shows, and now procedural crime dramas speak to Americans as a culture for whatever reason. But yeah, as it gets so popular, there are people who are doing it for the entertainment value, for the like, oh, hey, we can do a, you know, cop, criminologist, whatever show, and people are going to like that because people love those shows. There's this one issue of PM, that magazine I was talking about. There was a guy in Juarez who had been murdered, and they cut up his body into pieces and just dumped him in the street. And so he's like chopped up into like 13 pieces. And the headline on the newspaper was "Human Jigsaw Puzzle." You know, like, okay, yes, that is a noteworthy thing that has occurred, but the complete and utter lack of empathy for this man, for his family, you know, if you're approaching these stories from a purely entertainment value, you can slide into that lack of empathy. So we kind of talked about that before with the title of the show, that we were really kind of making a announcement that we were really trying to not slide into those tropes. And both with the podcast and with the film, I mean, certainly with the podcast, it's a lot easier because it's more of a documentary.
Speaking of other crime stories, did either of you have an interest in true crime prior to joining the Red Note? And if so, what case sparked your interest?
Not especially. Like, I mean, when we started marketing the podcast, I subscribed to all of these Facebook groups, like true crime groups, to share new episodes with people who were like big true crime fans. And I remember I saw this one post on one of these boards. This woman had written, "God, I can't wait to get home from work and curl up under a blanket with a cup of hot chocolate and listen to my favorite serial killer podcast." And I was like, I don't think that lady is going to be into the Red Note, because, I mean, it is a true crime podcast in a lot of ways, but it's not a whodunit. It's not like, did Oswald kill JFK? So, I mean, you're talking about like hundreds of women that were murdered, thousands that have been disappeared over the course of 27 years. There's so many different, profiles of different victims and what jobs they had and why they were killed. There's so much complexity to it that it's not going to be like a Law and Order episode where at the end they lock the guy up and you're like, we wrapped that story up. There's no way that this story can end except in a kind of open-ended fashion without fundamentally betraying the reality of what has happened. That's why, like, in episode 2, it's called The Juarez Ripper, but it's in quotes because it's like there's that version of the femicide in Juarez, like the, whoa, FBI profilers hunting down a serial killer, but there are so many other aspects to it. And I think that while it has a lot of the hallmarks of like a true crime story, I think it's got a lot of very different story beats in it. Like, I really like David Fincher's film Zodiac, which again ends in a very similarly kind of like unresolved way. And like in a lot of ways, that's like a serial killer movie, but in a lot of ways, it's not a serial killer movie. Again, that's going back to the very first question you guys asked me. As a filmmaker, that's kind of interesting that you, in staying true to the stories of the families and the kind of sociological phenomenon that have taken place in Juarez, you're also able to kind of offer a revisionist take on the true crime genre at the same time, and like get into approaching it in a way that's very prismatic and multifaceted. It's nice when you're able to do something that is stimulating for you as a professional and that is also hopefully putting something good into the world that, I don't know that a podcast or a movie is going to like magically transform this problem, but if we can just make it a little bit better, if we can open some people's eyes to the complexity of these things or help people empathize with what many people in Mexico experience. I think it's really easy to have that kind of like Donald Trump, they're sending rapists and drug dealers attitude if you know absolutely nothing about what people experience south of the border. And if nothing else, if we can just help people understand those stories and empathize with those experiences, then all of the years of work we've put into bringing this thing to the finish line will have been very, very worth the effort.
In pop culture, investigative journalism is portrayed as a sort of adrenaline rush. What's something most people may not know about investigative journalism?
Well, I want to be really modest in my answer here because my journalism experience was being an associate editor at the Daily Texan when I was in college. I mean, I guess this has been a journalistic project too, but, having somebody like Lydia Cacho involved in, Lydia's like a rock star investigative journalist. And so I want to be really, really, really modest in my answer because it's like, Lydia's a major leaguer and I'm like in little league, I guess what did I discover in this process? I think getting to witness the community in Juarez was really exciting and interesting for me because a lot of the people we spoke with were colleagues of Elisia's or other journalists that I knew, that Lydia knew, that had covered this story or had written books about it. And it was really interesting for me to witness the camaraderie in that community. You know, I mean, to be an investigative journalist along the border in Juarez is a very challenging job. We went to El Diario de Juarez when we were there, and there's a desk that one of their colleagues had been murdered a few years ago, and they keep his desk permanently unoccupied as a memorial to this colleague that they had lost. And I think part of the camaraderie stems from the fact that investigative journalists along the border and in Mexico are so embattled and face such a ever-present threat of violence that they have to team up and look out for each other and be there for each other when one of them is the victim of violence. But getting to witness that camaraderie was not really something that I or Estefania went into the project kind of thinking about. It was really nice to get to witness that and be a small part of it. To get to work with these great journalists to put this story together was a real privilege for me, and I feel really lucky we got to collaborate with Alicia and collaborate with Lydia. And also, I really think it's important that everybody at Imperative, which is the production company we worked with to do the podcast, they were really committed to making this project as authentic a presentation of this story as it possibly could be. Not just in terms of like having a local flavor, air quotes, but doing a totally Spanish version of the podcast at the same time we had a totally English version, you know, so that someone can listen to all 10 episodes in English or in Spanish, which has been really great because people in Mexico, Central America, South America, Spain have been able to hear it, which they would probably not have been able to do in great numbers if it had just been in English. And Estefania and I are very grateful to Jason and Laura at Imperative Entertainment for believing in the concept and believing in the team that we've put together and trusting everybody to just go out and do it without micromanaging the entire process, which is a really rare thing. Not every production company in Hollywood is going to be that forward thinking and that progressive in their working methods. There's so many people without whom this project would not have been finished in the way that it has. And obviously Lydia and Alicia and Estefania and all the crew members were big in that. But, you know, at the end of the day, if somebody doesn't believe in you and invest their trust in your team's abilities, it's impossible to get those things done. And we were really lucky to be able to partner with a company like Imperative to do this project.
Yes, okay, so thank you for sharing that with us. Was there another fun or positive memory that you had with working with the Red Note team or just with your experience in visiting Ciudad Juarez in general?
Something that always amazed me is that in the cities or in the places that goes through a lot of pain and a lot of darkness, you can find the people who cherish more your friendship and cherish a lot that you're talking about them in a way that you are caring and that you are trying to do good to them. I think that one of my happiest and one of the greatest things that for me happened in Ciudad Juarez was to experience that everybody always tries to see the light in the dark. Everybody tries to see the good in the bad. Everybody tries to see how they thrive against all odds and how they still live there and they still love Ciudad Juarez. They still love the place they live. They still love the people. They still love the community they have built for themselves in such a hard situation and through such a hard circumstances, because all of them had to live together. They only have themselves as their own support network in a way as people, as they can reflect into each other and they can like relate to the pain and through the obstacles and challenges that as a city and as citizens of this city they have had to gone through. For me, I think that's the happiest thing that I could ever think about, you know, and I think that's the greatest thing that you could say about Ciudad Juarez. I mean, it's such a welcoming place. It's a hard place, but it's such a welcoming people, and it's such a beautiful people who are over there. As Craig just said, I mean, somebody that comes to you and say, thank you for coming here and do this project, and thank you for talking about something that for us is so important and has been so painful. That's something that we heard a lot of times when we were there. Even the families opening their hearts to us to talk about the most excruciating and the most difficult portion of the experiences, life experiences that they have to be part of, no? About the murdering or the disappearing of your own daughter. I mean, I can't understand how big their hearts are to open up, even to tell you that kind of things, and the trust that they invest in you to giving you that piece of story of their own life story. They do not owe us nothing, but they do it with all their hearts and all their love and all their soul. So for me, I think that's the happiest thing. It's refreshing. It's lovely. It's beautiful. For me, it's that.
Yeah, it's a really inspiring message, and I'm glad we were able to end this episode on a more uplifting note. So really quickly, could you all share with me what comes after the Red Note? Are there any new projects that are in the works right now? Can you share a little about that?
About next projects, well, with Craig, we're trying to come up with some podcasts that goes around Latin America, talking about some social issues, kind of similar to the Red Note. We're trying to prepare that kind of stories, hoping that we could do that later this year. And well, we have the movie, the Red Note movie, that I think that Craig should talk about that one.
Well, we're very hopeful that having finished the podcast that we'll be able to begin work in earnest on producing the feature film in the not too distant future. Estefania and I are working very, very hard to make that production a reality as soon as we possibly can.
Great. So that brings our episode to a close. So thank you so much for spending time with us and taking the time to chat with us today.
If you're interested in pursuing a career in media, make sure to visit us at latinitasmagazine.org for more information. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of 20 Questions With. We'll see you next time.